The sun hung high in the sky, its oppressive heat mirroring the tension on the bustling city street below. Children's laughter mingled with the steady hum of car engines, creating an ordinary urban backdrop. But suddenly, that sense of normalcy shattered. "Hey, you! Stop right there!" The voice rang out sharp and commanding, cutting through the noise like a blade. Passers-by froze mid-step, their heads turning toward the commotion. A towering police officer stood in the middle of the sidewalk, his face twisted with anger, his hand gripping the baton at his side. In front of him sat a young boy in a wheelchair, his hands clenching the armrests as though holding on for dear life. His wide, frightened eyes darted toward the crowd, but no one moved to help. "I said stop," the officer barked, his tone dripping with authority and menace. The boy stammered, his voice barely a whisper. I'm just waiting for my dad." But that wasn't enough. The officer's sneer deepened, his hands moving to grab the boy's wheelchair. "Waiting for your dad, huh? We'll see about that. You're trespassing, kid." The street grew quieter, the air heavy with tension. The crowd watched in stunned silence, unsure whether to step in or remain bystanders to the brewing storm. Before we dive deeper into this gripping story of injustice, courage, and resilience, comment below where you're watching from today. And if you're already hooked by this intense tale of a father and son standing up against abuse of power, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The blazing sun bore down on the bustling city streets, transforming the urban artery into a cauldron of activity. The laughter of children blended with honking car horns, painting a picture of normalcy amidst the chaos. Then, like a sharp needle puncturing a balloon, a commanding voice shattered the hum of the afternoon. "Hey, you, stop!" The shout was loud and accusatory, slicing through the crowd like a whip. Passers-by halted in their tracks, their heads turning toward the source of the disruption. In the middle of the sidewalk stood a large man in a police uniform, his face twisted into a scowl of unrestrained anger. Across from him sat a young boy, no older than 10. His name was Marcus, and he was seated in a wheelchair. His delicate hands clung tightly to the armrests, his expression frozen in fear, as if the chair was the last bastion of his security. "Didn't you hear me?" Officer Frank Miller barked, his tone sharp and threatening as he took a menacing step forward. The boy looked up briefly, but immediately lowered his gaze. His lips quivered, words forming but failing to escape his mouth. The crowd, momentarily transfixed, exchanged uneasy glances, but made no move to intervene. "I'm just waiting for my dad," Marcus finally stammered, his voice barely audible over the background noise. "Your dad?" Officer Miller sneered, his lips curling into a mocking grin. "Sure, he'll show up with a good story, won't he?" But in the meantime, without waiting for an explanation, Miller reached out and gripped the handles of Marcus's wheelchair with alarming force. "Please, don't touch it," Marcus cried out, clutching the armrests as tightly as he could. "Don't touch it." Miller's voice rose with incredulity, as if the boy's resistance was an affront to his authority. "You're trespassing, kid. I said get up and show me your papers." The officer's rough push caused the wheelchair to lurch, nearly toppling Marcus to the ground. A collective gasp rippled through the onlookers, and a middle-aged woman hesitated, stepping forward before freezing under the officer's icy glare. "He's just a child," a voice called out from the crowd, trembling with restrained outrage. Miller's sharp response came immediately, silencing the budding dissent. "Mind your own business." Turning back to Marcus, Miller's eyes narrowed with disdain. "This citizen is obviously hiding something," he spat. Marcus sat silent, his small hands trembling as tears welled in his wide, fearful eyes. Ignoring the boy's clear distress, Miller tugged violently at the wheelchair, pulling it out from under Marcus's arms. The boy tumbled to the pavement, landing with a sharp thud. The crowd froze, their collective horror palpable. Yet, no one moved. Some averted their eyes, unwilling to acknowledge the injustice unfolding before them, while others watched with morbid curiosity, too fascinated to intervene. Miller, emboldened by the crowd's inaction, turned to address them directly. "Look at him!" he shouted, pointing at Marcus as the boy struggled to prop himself up on trembling arms. "He's an example of your pathetic attempts to demand rights. Can't even stand without help, yet he thinks he deserves privileges." With a dismissive snarl, the officer tossed the wheelchair aside like it was trash. It bounced off the pavement and clattered against the curb, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the tense silence. Marcus lay on the asphalt, his thin arms trembling as he attempted to lift himself. His palms were already scraped and bloody from the fall, but he made no sound. His silence, however, betrayed his shame and fear, which burned brighter with each passing moment. No one in the crowd moved. They remained frozen, rooted to the pavement by fear or apathy. Some pulled out their phones, their silent cameras documenting the scene. Others whispered among themselves, their hushed tones revealing their discomfort. Still, not a single hand was extended to Marcus. The boy, feeling the weight of the world pressing down on his small shoulders, glanced around desperately, his eyes pleading for mercy and understanding. At that moment, a commanding voice shattered the oppressive stillness. "Take your hands off my son." The words, spoken with calm yet unyielding authority, rolled through the street like distant thunder before a storm. The crowd parted instinctively, though an invisible force compelled them to make way. Striding purposefully through the gap was Nathan Carter, a tall man in his 40s, his face calm but with eyes that burned with restrained fury. His every step radiated confidence, and his presence instantly shifted the air around the scene. Officer Frank Miller paused, glancing up at the approaching figure. His smirk faltered briefly, but his pride quickly masked any hesitation. He leaned on the handle of his baton, watching Nathan with a sneer. "Oh, so you're the dad," Miller said mockingly, straightening his stance as if to challenge Nathan's authority. "I can see where he gets his boldness from." Nathan stopped just short of Marcus, who was still on the ground, his trembling hands unable to lift his small frame. Kneeling, Nathan gently placed a steadying hand on his son's shoulder. "It's okay, Marcus," Nathan said softly, his voice filled with reassurance. "I'm here now." Marcus looked up, his tear-filled eyes meeting his father's. For the first time since the ordeal began, a flicker of hope appeared on his face. Miller interrupted the tender moment with a derisive laugh. "Oh, how touching. You think you're going to waltz in here and play the hero?" Nathan stood slowly, his full height towering over Miller. His posture exuded calm authority, a stark contrast to Miller's loud aggression. "What I think," Nathan said, his voice low but steady, "is that you've made a grave mistake." Miller's smirk wavered, but he quickly doubled down, unwilling to show weakness. "Grave mistake? Listen, buddy, I'm the law here. Your rights don't mean anything when you're out of order." He gestured to Marcus with his baton. "Your boy was trespassing, and he's obviously hiding something. I'm just doing my job." Nathan's expression didn't change, but his words cut through Miller's arrogance like a knife. "Your job," Nathan said slowly, "does not include humiliating a child or abusing your power." The tension in the air grew heavier. Some members of the crowd began to murmur in agreement, their discomfort turning to indignation. Phones were now openly recording, and the small cameras were trained on Miller's every move. Miller took a step forward, his grip tightening on the baton. "You don't get to tell me how to do my job," he snapped. "People like you think you're above the rules. Always demanding special treatment, always crying about discrimination." His tone dripped with venom. "Well, not on my watch." Nathan didn't flinch. His calm demeanor seemed to unnerve Miller, whose bravado was beginning to show cracks. "You're angry," Nathan said, his voice measured. "But your anger isn't with my son, it's with something deeper inside you. Something you've let control you. Don't lecture me." Miller barked, his voice rising. He swung the baton in a wide arc, pointing it accusingly at Nathan. "If you don't back off, I'll arrest you both for obstruction." The crowd collectively inhaled, shocked at Miller's escalating hostility. Several onlookers began shouting, their voices blending into a cacophony of outrage. "Leave them alone! He's just a kid! This is too much!" Miller spun around, glaring at the crowd. "Stay out of it," he shouted, his voice tinged with desperation. But the shift was already happening. Where there had been silence and hesitation, there was now anger and defiance. Nathan seized the moment, his voice rising just enough to cut through the noise. "You don't understand what you've done, Officer Miller," he said, his words deliberate and heavy. "But you will." The declaration hung in the air, pregnant with meaning. Miller's eyes darted between Nathan and the crowd, his confidence visibly shaken. He pointed at Marcus, who had managed to sit up with Nathan's help. "This little brat doesn't deserve a wheelchair," Miller sneered. He's probably faking it like the rest of you, looking for handouts. The cruelty of the words shocked the crowd into silence, but only for a moment. A young woman in the front row of onlookers gasped audibly. "You can't say that," she shouted, her voice quivering with indignation. Nathan's face darkened, but his tone remained calm. "You're digging yourself deeper, officer," he said. "Every word, every action is being recorded. You've already lost." Miller hesitated, glancing around at the dozens of phones pointed at him. His bravado faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. "What are you going to do, huh?" he growled, his voice lower now, almost pleading. "You think a video is going to save you?" Nathan stepped closer, his presence commanding. "It's not about the video, officer. It's about accountability. You think you can act without consequences because of your badge. But that ends here." The murmurs in the crowd grew louder, the tide of public opinion clearly turning against Miller. For the first time, he looked genuinely unsure. Nathan knelt again, his attention back on Marcus. "Are you okay, son?" he asked softly. Marcus nodded shakily, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm okay, Dad." Nathan smiled gently and ruffled his son's hair. Then he turned back to Miller, his expression hardening. "You've humiliated my son, abused your power, and made a mockery of the law. There will be consequences." Miller's face flushed with anger and fear. He opened his mouth to respond, but the sound of sirens in the distance made him pause. The crowd parted again as the police arrived, their presence signaling the beginning of a reckoning. The sound of sirens in the distance seemed to charge the air with even more tension, but Officer Frank Miller wasn't ready to concede. His pride was wounded, and the weight of the crowd's disapproval only made him more desperate to assert his authority. Marcus, still sitting on the cold pavement, tried to push himself up again. His scraped palms throbbed with pain, and streaks of blood stained the asphalt. His thin arms trembled under the strain, and he fell back down with a soft cry of frustration. "Stay down if you can't get up," Miller spat venomously, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "You think the world owes you something just because you're in a chair?" The words stung more than the physical pain, but Marcus didn't respond. His lips quivered and tears welled up in his eyes. He blinked rapidly, determined not to let them fall, knowing that his tears would only fuel the mockery. Nathan Carter, standing protectively beside his son, tightened his jaw. His calm exterior belied the storm of emotions churning within him: anger, frustration, and a fierce determination to protect his child. "You've gone too far, Officer Miller," Nathan said, his voice steady and sharp. "No badge gives you the right to treat another human being like this, let alone a child." Miller glared at Nathan, his fists clenching and unclenching. He seemed torn between backing down and doubling down, his ego warring with the reality of the growing crowd, now buzzing with condemnation. "You think you're better than me?" Miller snapped, his tone defensive. "You think your suit and your words make you untouchable?" Nathan didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he knelt beside Marcus again, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "I've got you, son," he said softly, his words a quiet balm against the chaos surrounding them. The crowd began to stir more boldly now. A teenage boy with a baseball cap stepped forward, holding his phone high as he recorded. "We're all watching," he called out, his voice steady despite the tension. "Everything you've done, everything you've said, it's all on camera." Miller's head snapped toward the teenager, his eyes narrowing. "Turn that off," he barked, striding toward him with menacing intent. "Filming an officer without permission is illegal." The teenager didn't flinch. "Actually, it's not," he replied confidently. "We have the right to film in public. And trust me, this is going live." The crowd buzzed with approval, and more phones appeared in the air, their lenses trained on Miller. The officer hesitated, visibly rattled by the growing wall of evidence against him. Nathan rose to his feet, his presence commanding the attention of everyone, including Miller. "You've spent years hiding behind your badge," Nathan said, his voice calm but resolute. "But today, you've exposed yourself for what you truly are, a bully who thrives on fear." Miller's face turned a deep shade of red, a mixture of embarrassment and rage. "You don't know anything about me," he snarled. "You don't know what I've been through, what I've had to deal with." Nathan's gaze didn't waver. "What you've been through doesn't excuse what you've done," he replied firmly. "We all face struggles. But the difference is how we choose to respond. You chose hatred. Miller took a step back, the weight of Nathan's words hitting harder than he'd expected. He glanced at the crowd, now openly murmuring and pointing, their collective judgment heavy in the air. Meanwhile, Marcus, still on the ground, mustered the courage to speak. His voice was soft but steady as he looked up at Miller. "Why do you hate me?" he asked, the innocence of his question cutting through the tension like a blade. The crowd fell silent, their attention focused entirely on the boy. Even Miller seemed taken aback by the question, his bluster momentarily fading. "I don't hate you," Miller said, his tone defensive but lacking conviction. You're in the wrong place at the wrong time." Nathan's eyes flashed with anger. "He's a child, officer. A child who did nothing to deserve your cruelty." Before Miller could respond, the wail of the approaching sirens grew louder, and 2 squad cars pulled up to the curb. Uniformed officers stepped out, their faces grim as they surveyed the scene. One of them, a sergeant with a calm but authoritative demeanor, approached Miller. "What's going on here, Frank?" he asked, his tone wary. Miller straightened his posture, clearly trying to regain his composure. "Just handling a situation, sir," he said quickly, gesturing toward Marcus and Nathan. They were causing a disturbance. The sergeant's eyes flicked to Nathan, then to Marcus, who was still on the ground, his hands bloodied and his face pale. He frowned. "Doesn't look like they're the ones causing a disturbance," he said pointedly. Nathan stepped forward, his voice firm but controlled. "Sergeant, I'm Nathan Carter. My son was sitting peacefully in his wheelchair when Officer Miller decided to harass him, physically assault him, and humiliate him in front of all these witnesses." The sergeant's frown deepened as he looked around at the crowd, many of whom nodded in agreement or held up their phones as proof. "Is this true?" he asked, his gaze shifting back to Miller. Miller opened his mouth to protest, but the sergeant raised a hand to silence him. "Save it. We'll sort this out at the station." He turned to Nathan and Marcus. "Are you both okay?" Nathan nodded. "We will be," he said, his voice steady. The sergeant gestured to the other officers. "Get statements from the witnesses. I want to see every video taken here today." As the officers moved to interview the crowd, Miller stood frozen, his confidence crumbling under the weight of accountability. The sergeant looked at him with disappointment. "You've got a lot to answer for, Frank." Nathan knelt beside Marcus again, gently helping him to his feet. "It's over now," he said softly, though his eyes carried the weight of what had just happened. Marcus nodded, leaning against his father for support. The crowd watched in silence, their respect for Nathan's composure evident in their expressions. But Nathan knew this was only the beginning. Justice had to be served, and he was ready to see it through. As the sergeant and other officers worked to gather statements and review video evidence from the crowd, the tension in the air began to shift. Where there had been fear and hesitation, there was now a palpable sense of solidarity. People who had remained silent earlier were finding their voices, speaking up about what they had witnessed. This officer pushed the boy out of his wheelchair. One elderly woman told an officer, her voice trembling with anger. He was cruel and completely out of control. Another bystander, a man in his 30s, held up his phone. "I've got the whole thing recorded." He called the kid a faker and threw his wheelchair like it was trash. It was disgusting. As more witnesses came forward, their accounts painted a damning picture of Officer Frank Miller's actions. The sergeant, visibly troubled, exchanged a serious look with one of his colleagues. "This is not good," he muttered under his breath. Meanwhile, Nathan Carter stood protectively beside Marcus, who was now sitting on the curb, his legs stretched out in front of him. Nathan had draped his suit jacket over his son's shoulders, shielding him from the curious stares of the crowd. "Are you okay, Marcus?" Nathan asked gently, crouching down to meet his son's gaze. Marcus nodded hesitantly, though his eyes were still glassy with unshed tears. "I'm okay, Dad," he whispered. "Just tired." Nathan smiled softly and ruffled Marcus's hair. "You're strong, son. We'll get through this together." The sight of the father and son seemed to galvanize the crowd further. A young woman holding a protest sign, who had been passing by and stopped when she saw the commotion, stepped forward. "What's this officer's name?" she demanded loudly. "People need to know who's behind this kind of behavior." "It's Frank Miller," someone from the crowd called out, and the name quickly began circulating among the bystanders. Social media was already buzzing. Dozens of videos had been uploaded, showing the entirety of Miller's actions. The hashtags Justice for Marcus and Accountability Now began trending within minutes. One particularly striking video, posted by the teenager in the baseball cap, showed Marcus lying on the pavement as Miller towered over him, yelling cruel insults. The caption read, "This is what abuse of power looks like. We will not stay silent." As Nathan helped Marcus back into his wheelchair, a local journalist arrived, her cameraman in tow. She approached Nathan cautiously, her microphone extended. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice professional, yet empathetic. "I'm Sarah Monroe from Channel 6 News. Can you tell us what happened here?" Nathan looked at Marcus, who gave a small nod of encouragement. Straightening up, Nathan faced the camera with calm determination. "My name is Nathan Carter," he said, his voice steady. "This officer, Frank Miller, humiliated and assaulted my son, Marcus, who did nothing wrong except sit in his wheelchair on a public sidewalk." The journalist's face reflected the shock and dismay of the crowd. "That's a serious accusation," she said. "Do you believe this is part of a larger problem?" "I don't believe. It's a fact," Nathan replied. "This isn't just about my son. It's about a system that enables people like Frank Miller to abuse their power without accountability. But today, that stops. I'll make sure of it." The crowd erupted into applause, their collective support buoying Nathan's resolve. Miller, standing off to the side and surrounded by other officers, watched with growing unease. His hands fidgeted, and his once confident posture sagged under the weight of public scrutiny. "You're not going to let him talk to the press like that, are you?" Miller hissed at the sergeant. The sergeant shot him a sharp look. "You're in no position to give advice right now, Frank." The journalist turned back to Nathan. "What do you plan to do next?" Nathan's expression hardened. "I'm filing a formal complaint against Frank Miller. But that's only the beginning. I'm going to use every resource at my disposal to ensure he faces justice, not just for Marcus, but for every person he's wronged." The murmurs of agreement from the crowd grew louder. People began chanting, their voices rising in unison. "Justice for Marcus! Justice for Marcus!" The chant echoed down the street, drawing even more onlookers to the scene. The momentum was unstoppable now, and Miller knew it. His face turned pale as he glanced nervously at the growing crowd and the cameras capturing every angle of his discomfort. "Sergeant, this is getting out of hand," Miller muttered, his voice betraying his fear. The sergeant didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stepped toward Nathan, his expression neutral but firm. "Mr. Carter," he said, "I assure you, we'll investigate this matter thoroughly. Please give us time to handle it properly." Nathan's eyes narrowed slightly. "I've seen investigations like this get swept under the rug before," he said. "But I'm not going anywhere. I'll make sure the truth comes out." The sergeant nodded, clearly aware of the high stakes. "Understood," he said. As the officers began escorting Miller toward one of the squad cars, the crowd erupted into cheers. People waved their phones in the air, recording every second of the disgraced officer's departure. But Nathan wasn't celebrating. He looked down at Marcus, his hand resting on his son's shoulder. "This is just the beginning," he said quietly. "We've got a long road ahead." Marcus nodded, his eyes reflecting a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "I know, Dad," he said, "but I'm ready." Nathan smiled, a proud and resolute expression crossing his face. Together they watched as Miller was driven away, his once imposing figure now reduced to a symbol of accountability. The crowd began to disperse, but the energy lingered. People exchanged contact information, promising to share their videos and support Nathan's fight for justice. Nathan turned to Marcus. "Let's get you home," he said gently. "You've been through enough for one day." Marcus leaned against his father as they made their way toward the car, the weight of the day's events heavy, but not crushing. They had won a battle, but Nathan knew the war for justice was far from over. The night after the incident, Nathan Carter sat in his study, replaying the events of the day in his mind. The videos uploaded online had already garnered hundreds of thousands of views, and the hashtags "Have Justice for Marcus" and "Frank Miller Exposed" were dominating social media. Comments poured in from people across the nation, expressing outrage and solidarity. Marcus was resting in his room, exhausted but calm. Nathan had reassured his son that justice would be served. and he intended to keep that promise. Nathan picked up his phone and dialed a number. "Sarah," he said when the line connected. "I need your help. We're going to make this case as public as possible." Sarah Monroe, the journalist who had interviewed him earlier, was quick to respond. "Absolutely, Nathan. This story needs to be told." The next morning, news stations across the country aired segments about the incident. The footage of Officer Frank Miller yanking the wheelchair from Marcus and shouting at him went viral. It was impossible to ignore the sheer cruelty on display, and the public demanded answers. At the police department, the atmosphere was tense. Frank Miller sat in a small office, his head in his hands. The sergeant entered, carrying a folder filled with complaints and evidence against him. "Frank," the sergeant said sharply, "this is bad. Really bad." Miller looked up, his face pale and drawn. "It's just one bad day," he muttered defensively. "I've served this department for years. I'm a good cop." The sergeant slammed the folder onto the desk. "A good cop? Frank, we've got years of complaints against you. Excessive force, racial bias, verbal abuse, the list goes on. We've managed to cover for you before, but not this time. The public's watching." Miller's jaw tightened. "So, what? You're just going to throw me under the bus?" The sergeant leaned in, his voice low and cold. "You threw yourself under the bus, Frank. Now you're going to face the consequences." While Miller stewed in his growing isolation, Nathan was busy rallying support. He held a press conference outside the courthouse, surrounded by community leaders, activists, and supporters. Marcus sat beside him, his presence a powerful reminder of what was at stake. Nathan addressed the crowd and the cameras. "What happened to my son was not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of a broken system, a system that allows officers like Frank Miller to abuse their power without accountability. That ends now." The crowd erupted into applause, their energy electric. Nathan continued, his voice steady but passionate. "We're not just fighting for Marcus. We're fighting for every child, every family, every individual who has been wronged by the people sworn to protect us. This is about justice, equality, and the kind of future we want to build for our children." After the press conference, Nathan filed an official lawsuit against Miller and the police department. The lawsuit detailed the physical and emotional harm Marcus had suffered, as well as the systemic failures that had allowed Miller's behavior to go unchecked. Social media exploded with support for Marcus and condemnation of Miller. Stories from others who had encountered Miller began to surface, painting a picture of a man who had long abused his position of power. One user wrote, "Frank Miller harassed my brother last year just for walking home late at night. We filed a complaint, but nothing happened. It's time for justice." Another commented, "This isn't just about one officer. This is about holding the whole system accountable. We're with you, Marcus." The outcry reached the police chief, who held an emergency press conference. His tone was somber as he addressed the public. "We have initiated a full investigation into Officer Frank Miller's conduct," he announced. "If he is found to have violated the law or our code of ethics, he will be held accountable. We are committed to restoring trust between the police and the community." But the public wasn't satisfied with promises. They wanted action. As the investigation progressed, journalists and internet sleuths dug into Miller's history. What they uncovered only fueled the outrage. Complaints of excessive force had been filed against him multiple times. Witnesses came forward, recounting incidents of Miller using unnecessary violence or targeting individuals based on their race or socioeconomic status. "He pulled over my son for no reason and made him sit on the curb for an hour," one woman said during an interview. "When I tried to ask what was going on, he threatened to arrest me too." A local bar owner recalled an incident where Miller had physically dragged a patron out of the establishment, claiming he was too loud. The patron was later released without charges, but the incident left a lasting scar. The weight of the evidence was too much to ignore. Miller was suspended from duty pending the outcome of the investigation, but the damage was already done. At a rally held in front of the police station, hundreds of people gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Marcus" and "End Police Brutality." Nathan stood at the forefront, his presence a rallying point for those demanding change. "Today we stand together," Nathan said, addressing the crowd. "Not just for my son, but for everyone who has been silenced, ignored, or mistreated. This is our moment to demand accountability and create a system that works for everyone. The crowd roared in agreement, their chants echoing through the city streets. As the rally continued, news broke that the district attorney's office was preparing to file criminal charges against Frank Miller, including abuse of power and assault. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community and gave renewed hope to those who had long sought justice. That evening, Nathan and Marcus sat together at home, reflecting on the day's events. Marcus looked up at his father, his expression thoughtful. "Do you think we'll really make a difference, Dad?" he asked quietly. Nathan smiled and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "We already have, Marcus, but this is just the beginning. Change doesn't happen overnight. It takes courage, persistence, and people like you, people who refuse to give up." Marcus nodded, a small smile forming on his face. For the first time since the incident, he felt a glimmer of hope, not just for himself, but for the future they were fighting to build. The next morning, headlines splashed across newspapers and online platforms echoed the public's outrage. Officer Miller faces criminal charges, justice for Marcus sparks a movement, and systemic accountability in question. It was clear that the incident had struck a chord far beyond the city where it happened. Nathan Carter's phone buzzed constantly with calls and messages from reporters, activists, and community leaders. Offers of support poured in, from legal experts volunteering their services to individuals sharing their own stories of mistreatment by law enforcement. "This is bigger than just us," Nathan said as he scrolled through the messages, addressing his wife, Alicia, who was seated beside him at the dining table. "People are finally speaking out." Alicia nodded, her expression a mixture of pride and concern. "But it's also dangerous," she said quietly. "You're taking on a system that doesn't like to be challenged." "Be careful, Nathan." Nathan reached out and squeezed her hand. "I will. But we can't back down now. Marcus needs to see that standing up for what's right matters." Meanwhile, the community's response was growing louder. Local organizations organized marches and rallies in support of Marcus and the Carter family. At one such event, hundreds gathered in the park, holding signs that read, "Justice for Marcus, accountability for all, and stop abuse of power." Nathan stood on a makeshift stage, addressing the crowd with Marcus at his side. His voice carried over the sea of supporters. "This isn't just about one officer or one family," he began. "This is about creating a system where no one, no child, no parent, ever has to experience what Marcus and I went through." The crowd erupted in cheers, their energy unyielding. People shared their own experiences with systemic abuse, many breaking down in tears as they recounted years of mistreatment. Nathan listened, offering words of encouragement and promising to use every resource available to bring about change. As Nathan and the community pressed forward, Frank Miller's reputation continued to unravel. Investigative journalists unearthed decades of complaints that had been buried or dismissed. One report revealed how Miller had been transferred multiple times within the department after incidents of excessive force. In one case, he was accused of detaining a black teenager for hours without cause, releasing him only after the boy's parents threatened legal action. These patterns aren't unique to Miller. One journalist stated during a televised segment, "They reveal systemic failures in how law enforcement handles complaints and disciplines officers." This isn't just about one bad cop, it's about a broken system. The revelations fueled public anger. Protests expanded, not just locally but in other cities as well, with demonstrators demanding accountability and reform. Amid the growing uproar, Marcus's story became a symbol of resilience. His face appeared on news programs and magazine covers, often accompanied by the now iconic image of him sitting on the curb, clutching his scraped palms as his father stood protectively beside him. Despite the attention, Marcus remained grounded. "I just want people to know what happened wasn't right," he said during a televised interview. "No one should be treated like that, especially not a kid." The interviewer, visibly moved, turned to Nathan. "Mr. Carter, your son's courage is inspiring millions. What message do you hope to send through this fight?" Nathan didn't hesitate. "The message is simple," he said firmly. "No one is above accountability, not even those who wear a badge. And for those who have been wronged, your voice matters. Speak up and don't let anyone silence you." The police department, under mounting pressure, announced sweeping internal investigations. A public statement from the police chief outlined new measures aimed at addressing systemic issues, including mandatory body cameras, independent oversight for misconduct cases, and bias training for officers. "We recognize the failures within our department," the police chief said during a press conference. "What happened to Marcus Carter was unacceptable, and we are committed to ensuring it never happens again." While some applauded the department's response, others remained skeptical. "It's not enough to talk about change," Nathan said in an interview. "We need to see action. Words are a good start, but only actions can rebuild trust." As the investigations progressed, Frank Miller faced criminal charges, including assault, abuse of power, and endangering the welfare of a minor. The announcement sent shockwaves through the community, marking a rare moment of accountability in a system often criticized for shielding its own. Miller, now a pariah even among his former colleagues, struggled to navigate the fallout. His home was vandalized, with graffiti reading "Justice for Marcus" sprayed across his garage door. Neighbors shunned him, and some openly told reporters they were glad to see him face consequences. "I used to think he was just doing his job," one neighbor said during an interview. "But after seeing the video and hearing all these stories, I realize he was a bully. He deserves everything coming his way." Nathan wasn't content to let the fight end with Miller's prosecution. He partnered with civil rights organizations to draft proposals for broader police reform, including the establishment of independent review boards and stricter accountability measures for officers who abused their power. At a town hall meeting, Nathan presented these proposals to local officials, his voice unwavering. "This is our chance to create real change," he said. "We owe it to Marcus and to every victim of injustice to make sure this never happens again." The meeting ended with a standing ovation, and city officials promised to review the proposals seriously. That night, back at home, Nathan sat with Marcus in the living room. The two watched the news together as the day's events were recapped. Marcus leaned against his father, his small frame comforted by Nathan's steady presence. "Do you think they'll actually change anything, Dad?" Marcus asked, his voice soft but curious. Nathan wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders. "They will," he said firmly, "because we won't let them ignore this. And because of you, Marcus, people are finally paying attention." Marcus smiled, his eyes shining with hope. "I'm glad you're my dad," he said quietly. Nathan smiled back, his heart swelling with pride. "And I'm glad you're my son," he replied. The fight was far from over, but Nathan knew they were on the right path. Together, they were turning pain into progress, ensuring that Marcus's story would be the catalyst for change. The case against Frank Miller gained traction far beyond the city limits. News outlets across the country covered the story, with headlines like "Officer Miller's Abuse Sparks Calls for Reform and Courage of a Young Boy Challenges Systemic Injustice." National civil rights leaders began to take notice, reaching out to Nathan Carter with offers of support. Among them was Angela Bryant, a well-known activist and advocate for police reform. She visited the Carters personally, her demeanor as warm as it was resolute. "Marcus, you are so brave," Angela said, kneeling to meet Marcus's eyes. "You've inspired millions of people to stand up for what's right." Marcus blushed, looking shyly at his father. Nathan smiled and put a hand on his son's shoulder. "We're just doing what needs to be done," he said humbly. "No," Angela corrected, her tone firm. "You're doing what many are too afraid to do. That matters." Angela's organization joined forces with Nathan, organizing a national campaign to raise awareness about police misconduct and the need for systemic reform. They launched petitions, held rallies, and lobbied lawmakers, ensuring that Marcus's story remained at the forefront of public consciousness. While Nathan and his allies gained momentum, Frank Miller found himself increasingly isolated. His legal team initially attempted to portray him as a victim of public backlash, claiming he had been under immense stress at the time of the incident. But their narrative quickly unraveled as more witnesses and evidence came forward. One former colleague testified anonymously, revealing a history of complaints about Miller's aggressive behavior. "We all knew Frank had a temper," the colleague admitted, "but the department always swept it under the rug." The media seized on these revelations, further damaging Miller's credibility. News commentators openly criticized the culture of silence within the police force that had allowed officers like Miller to thrive. Accountability starts at the top, one anchor declared during a primetime segment. It's not just about removing bad apples, it's about fixing the entire system that enables them. Across the country, protests grew larger and louder. People carried signs with Marcus's face, accompanied by slogans like "End Police Brutality" and "Justice for All." The movement transcended race and background, uniting people in a shared demand for fairness and accountability. One particularly powerful moment occurred during a televised rally in Washington, D.C., where Nathan delivered a passionate speech on the steps of the Capitol. "Marcus is my son," Nathan said, his voice carrying over the crowd. "But he could be anyone's son. That's why we're here. To make sure no child or family has to endure what we did. It's time to turn our outrage into action." The crowd erupted into cheers, their chants echoing through the city. "Justice for Marcus! Justice for Marcus!" Amid the chaos and attention, Marcus began to find his own strength. At first, he was hesitant to speak in public, preferring to let his father take the lead. But as he saw the impact their fight was having, he realized he had a voice that people wanted to hear. During a live interview on a major news network, Marcus sat beside Nathan, his hands folded nervously in his lap. The anchor turned to him with a kind smile. "Marcus, what would you say to people who are watching and supporting you?" Marcus hesitated for a moment before looking directly into the camera. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for caring. It means a lot to me and my dad." The anchor nodded encouragingly. "And what would you say to kids like you, who might be scared to speak up?" Marcus straightened slightly, his voice growing stronger. "Don't be afraid," he said. "You're not alone. There are people who will listen and help you. My dad always tells me that being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what's right, even when you're scared." Nathan beamed with pride as the audience applauded. The momentum of the movement caught the attention of lawmakers, some of whom began drafting legislation aimed at addressing police misconduct. Proposals included creating independent oversight boards, implementing stricter accountability measures, and increasing funding for community policing initiatives. Nathan was invited to testify before Congress, where he shared Marcus's story and advocated for meaningful change. "My son is just one example of many," Nathan told the congressional panel. "But his story shouldn't be dismissed as an anomaly. It's a symptom of a system that prioritizes power over accountability. If we want real change, we need to start by holding people accountable and rebuilding trust." Nathan's testimony was met with widespread praise, and several lawmakers publicly pledged their support for the proposed reforms. The trial of Frank Miller was a media spectacle, drawing national attention as people tuned in to watch the proceedings. Nathan and Marcus sat in the courtroom, surrounded by supporters, as the prosecution presented a damning case against Miller. Video footage of the incident was played repeatedly, showing Miller's harsh treatment of Marcus and his blatant disregard for the boy's dignity. Witnesses testified about Miller's history of misconduct, painting a picture of a man who had long abused his authority. Miller's defense team attempted to argue that he had acted out of frustration and poor judgment rather than malice, but the jury was unconvinced. After weeks of testimony, they returned a guilty verdict on multiple charges, including assault and abuse of power. As the judge read the verdict, a collective sense of relief washed over the courtroom. For Nathan and Marcus, it was a significant victory. Not just for their family, but for everyone who had supported them along the way. As the trial concluded, Marcus's story became a beacon of hope and resilience. His face appeared on murals and posters, often accompanied by the words, "Bravery changes everything." Nathan continued to use the platform they had built to advocate for systemic reform. He spoke at universities, community centers, and conferences, urging people to stay engaged and push for meaningful change. "Justice isn't a destination," Nathan often said. "It's a journey, and we all have a role to play." For Marcus, life slowly began to return to normal. With therapy and the unwavering support of his family, he found a renewed sense of confidence. At school, he was no longer seen as just a victim. He was a hero and an inspiration to his peers. As for Nathan, he knew the fight wasn't over. But standing beside his son, he felt a profound sense of purpose. Together, they had turned an act of cruelty into a catalyst for change, proving that even in the face of injustice, hope could prevail. The weeks following Frank Miller's trial marked a turning point in the fight for accountability. The verdict sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the nation, forcing them to confront the uncomfortable truths that had been swept under the rug for far too long. As the spotlight remained on Marcus's case, more stories surfaced, and people began coming forward with their own accounts of mistreatment by police officers. The floodgates had opened, and what emerged was a pattern of abuse, neglect, and complicity that implicated not just individuals but entire institutions. Nathan Carter found himself at the center of a burgeoning movement, his voice amplified by the countless others who now felt empowered to speak out. Investigations into Frank Miller's past unearthed a staggering number of complaints that had been dismissed or ignored. Some of these were minor infractions, but others involved serious allegations of misconduct. "He targeted my son for no reason," a woman said during a televised interview. "And when I tried to intervene, he threatened to arrest me too. I filed a complaint, but nothing ever came of it." Another man shared his story at a town hall meeting. "I lost my job because of him. He arrested me on false charges, and by the time they were dropped, the damage was already done." The stories were endless, and they painted a damning picture of a system that had enabled Miller to act without fear of repercussions. Unsurprisingly, the backlash was swift and fierce. Protesters gathered outside police stations across the country, their voices echoing demands for reform. Signs reading "No more cover-ups and hold them accountable" became a common sight. But not everyone welcomed the scrutiny. "Not all cops are bad," a local union leader said during a heated press conference. "We're being vilified for the actions of a few. This kind of narrative makes it harder for officers to do their jobs." Nathan, however, wasn't deterred by the criticism. In an interview, he responded calmly but firmly. "This isn't about demonizing law enforcement," he said. "It's about addressing the flaws in the system that allow abuses to happen. Accountability isn't anti-police, it's pro-justice." As more people rallied around the cause, Marcus became a symbol of resilience and hope. Schools invited him to speak about his experiences, and his message was always clear: stand up for what's right, no matter how hard it seems. At one event, Marcus addressed a room full of middle school students, his voice steady but earnest. "When that officer pushed me out of my chair," he said, "I felt powerless. But my dad taught me that real power isn't about being bigger or stronger. It's about being brave enough to stand up for yourself and others." The students erupted into applause, some wiping away tears. Marcus smiled shyly, still adjusting to the attention, but grateful for the opportunity to make a difference. Meanwhile, Nathan worked tirelessly to turn public outcry into tangible reform. He partnered with advocacy groups to draft legislation aimed at addressing systemic issues within law enforcement. The proposed measures included independent oversight boards to handle complaints against officers, mandatory de-escalation training to reduce the use of force, stricter penalties for officers found guilty of misconduct, whistleblower protections for officers who reported unethical behavior. Nathan presented the proposals to city officials at a public hearing. His speech was impassioned but measured, his words resonating with the packed room. "We're not asking for perfection," he said. "We're asking for accountability, because without it, there can be no trust, and without trust, there can be no justice." The hearing ended with a standing ovation, and several officials publicly pledged their support for the reforms. As the pressure mounted, the police department couldn't ignore its role in enabling Miller's behavior. An internal review revealed systemic failures in how complaints were handled, leading to the dismissal or cover-up of serious allegations. In a rare move, the police chief held a press conference to address the findings. "We failed our community," she admitted, her tone solemn. "What happened to Marcus Carter should never have happened. And for that, we are deeply sorry." The apology was met with mixed reactions. While some appreciated the acknowledgement, others saw it as too little, too late. Nathan was among the latter. "Words are a start," he said during an interview, "but they mean nothing without action. We'll be watching closely to make sure those actions happen." A month after his trial, Frank Miller was sentenced to 3 years in prison for his crimes. The sentence was seen as a victory, but Nathan knew the fight wasn't over. "This isn't about one man going to jail," Nathan said. "It's about creating a system where no one else has to go through what Marcus did." The sentence sent a clear message, and other police departments began taking a closer look at their own practices. Some implemented reforms preemptively, hoping to avoid similar scandals. Others faced public pressure to follow suit. As Nathan and Marcus continued their advocacy, their efforts began to yield real results. Several cities passed laws implementing the reforms Nathan had championed, and a national conversation about accountability in law enforcement was well underway. For Marcus, the experience was transformative. While he still bore the physical and emotional scars of that day, he had found a sense of purpose in helping others. "I used to think I was just a kid in a wheelchair," he said during a speech at a community event. "But now I know I'm more than that. We're all more than what people see on the outside." The crowd gave him a standing ovation, their admiration for his courage evident in their applause. One evening, Nathan and Marcus sat on the porch of their home, watching the sunset. The air was quiet, a welcome reprieve from the whirlwind of the past few months. "Do you think we did enough?" Marcus asked, his voice thoughtful. Nathan looked at his son, his expression both proud and reflective. "We've done a lot," he said, "but there's always more to do. Change doesn't happen overnight, it happens one step at a time. And you've taken some pretty big steps, Marcus." Marcus smiled, leaning against his father. "I couldn't have done it without you." Nathan wrapped an arm around his son's shoulders, his heart full. "And I couldn't have done it without you," he replied. Together they had turned pain into progress, proving that even the smallest voices could inspire the loudest calls for change. Several months had passed since the day Marcus Carter's life changed forever. What began as a moment of cruelty on a city sidewalk had sparked a national movement, shining a light on systemic issues that many had ignored for far too long. For Marcus and Nathan, the journey was far from over, but they could now see the tangible results of their efforts. In the wake of Frank Miller's sentencing and the widespread protests, several states enacted new legislation to address police misconduct. The changes included establishing independent review boards to investigate complaints against officers, implementing mandatory bias and de-escalation training for law enforcement, requiring body cameras for all on-duty officers, with severe penalties for tampering or failing to use them. Nathan Carter's voice had been instrumental in pushing these reforms forward. His testimony before Congress, combined with his relentless advocacy, had inspired others to join the cause. "I'm not a politician," Nathan said during an interview with a major news outlet. "I'm a father. And as a father, I couldn't stand by and let my son or anyone else's child be treated this way. We need to build a system that values humanity over power." Back in their city, the Carters became local heroes. Marcus, once hesitant to step into the spotlight, embraced his role as a symbol of hope and resilience. At school, he was greeted with high fives and kind words from classmates who admired his bravery. One day, during an assembly, the principal invited Marcus to speak to the students about his experience. Standing in front of his peers, Marcus took a deep breath and began. "When that officer pushed me out of my chair, I thought no one cared," he said. "I felt small, like I didn't matter. But then I realized I wasn't alone. My dad stood up for me, and so did so many other people. And now, because of all of us, things are starting to change." The students erupted into applause, some standing to cheer. Marcus smiled, a sense of pride and purpose lighting up his face. While Marcus thrived, Frank Miller's life unraveled further. His name had become synonymous with abuse of power, and he found himself ostracized wherever he went. Journalists continued to uncover stories of Miller's misconduct, painting a grim picture of a man who had long operated with impunity. Former colleagues distanced themselves, eager to avoid association with his tarnished reputation. Even in prison, Miller was a pariah. Guards treated him coldly, and other inmates viewed him with contempt. For the first time, he experienced the isolation and judgment he had inflicted on others. In a rare interview conducted from behind bars, Miller was asked if he regretted his actions. His response was bitter and defensive. "They ruined my life over one bad day," he said, his voice laced with anger. "No one cared about the pressure I was under. They just wanted a scapegoat." The interviewer, unimpressed, pressed further. "Do you think Marcus Carter deserved what happened to him?" Miller hesitated, his face hardening. "It doesn't matter what I think," he muttered. "What's done is done." The public's response to the interview was swift and unforgiving. For many, Miller's lack of remorse only underscored the need for systemic reform. Several months had passed since the day Marcus Carter's life changed forever. What began as a moment of cruelty on a city sidewalk had sparked a national movement, shining a light on systemic issues that many had ignored for far too long. For Marcus and Nathan, the journey was far from over. But they could now see the tangible results of their efforts. In the wake of Frank Miller's sentencing and the widespread protests, several states enacted new legislation to address police misconduct. The changes included establishing independent review boards to investigate complaints against officers, implementing mandatory bias and de-escalation training for law enforcement, requiring body cameras for all on-duty officers, with severe penalties for tampering or failing to use them. Nathan Carter's voice had been instrumental in pushing these reforms forward. His testimony before Congress, combined with his relentless advocacy, had inspired others to join the cause. "I'm not a politician," Nathan said during an interview with a major news outlet. "I'm a father. And as a father, I couldn't stand by and let my son, or anyone else's child, be treated this way. We need to build a system that values humanity over power." Back in their city, the Carters became local heroes. Marcus, once hesitant to step into the spotlight, embraced his role as a symbol of hope and resilience. At school, he was greeted with high fives and kind words from classmates who admired his bravery. One day, during an assembly, the principal invited Marcus to speak to the students about his experience. Standing in front of his peers, Marcus took a deep breath and began. "When that officer pushed me out of my chair, I thought no one cared," he said. "I felt small, like I didn't matter. But then I realized I wasn't alone. My dad stood up for me, and so did so many other people. And now, because of all of us, things are starting to change." The students erupted into applause, some standing to cheer. Marcus smiled, a sense of pride and purpose lighting up his face. While Marcus thrived, Frank Miller's life unraveled further. His name had become synonymous with abuse of power, and he found himself ostracized wherever he went. Journalists continued to uncover stories of Miller's misconduct, painting a grim picture of a man who had long operated with impunity. Former colleagues distanced themselves, eager to avoid association with his tarnished reputation. Even in prison, Miller was a pariah. Guards treated him coldly, and other inmates viewed him with contempt. For the first time, he experienced the isolation and judgment he had inflicted on others. In a rare interview conducted from behind bars, Miller was asked if he regretted his actions. His response was bitter and defensive. "They ruined my life over one bad day," he said, his voice laced with anger. "No one cared about the pressure I was under. They just wanted a scapegoat." The interviewer, unimpressed, pressed further. "Do you think Marcus Carter deserved what happened to him?" Miller hesitated, his face hardening. "It doesn't matter what I think," he muttered. "What's done is done." The public's response to the interview was swift and unforgiving. For many, Miller's lack of remorse only underscored the need for systemic reform. A year after the incident that changed everything, Marcus and Nathan Carter stood together at a large community event held in their honor. The city park, once the site of countless protests demanding justice for Marcus, was now bustling with activity for a celebration of change. Families gathered under the warm sun, children laughing and running across the grass. Booths lined the sidewalks, each representing organizations dedicated to justice, inclusion, and community building. At the center of it all was a stage, where Nathan and Marcus prepared to address the crowd. The past year had been transformative. The reforms Nathan had championed were now law in multiple states, setting a precedent for the nation. Rise for Justice, the nonprofit Nathan had founded, continued to grow, supporting victims of police misconduct and advocating for systemic change. Marcus's story had inspired millions, sparking conversations about justice and accountability in schools, workplaces, and government offices. His face, once a symbol of pain and vulnerability, had become a beacon of resilience and hope. Standing on the stage, Marcus adjusted the microphone nervously. He glanced at his father, who gave him a reassuring nod. Taking a deep breath, Marcus addressed the crowd. "Thank you all for being here," Marcus began, his voice steady despite his nerves. "A year ago, I never thought I'd be standing here. I didn't think anyone cared about what happened to me." He paused, his eyes scanning the faces in the crowd. "But you proved me wrong. You showed me that when people come together, they can make a difference." Applause erupted, but Marcus wasn't finished. "I've learned a lot this past year," he continued. "I learned that being strong doesn't mean you never cry. It means you get back up, even when it's hard. And I learned that even when you feel small, your voice can be big enough to change the world." The crowd cheered, their admiration for Marcus evident. Nathan watched with pride as his son, once so hesitant to speak, commanded the attention of everyone present. When the applause died down, Nathan stepped forward. His voice carried the calm confidence of a man who had weathered countless storms. "Marcus is right," he began. "None of this would have been possible without all of you. Your voices, your support, your courage, they're what made the difference." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the crowd. "But our work isn't done. Justice isn't something we achieve once and then forget about. It's something we have to fight for every day." Nathan spoke about the progress they had made, the new laws, the growing awareness, and the sense of hope that had emerged from tragedy. But he also emphasized the need for continued vigilance. "We've proven that change is possible," he said. "But there are still too many Marcus Carters out there, too many families who need our help. Let's keep fighting for them. Let's keep making a difference." The crowd rose to its feet, their cheers a powerful affirmation of Nathan's words. As the event continued, Nathan and Marcus mingled with attendees, exchanging stories and laughter. They met families who shared their own experiences of injustice, many of whom credited the Carters' bravery for inspiring them to speak out. One young boy, about Marcus's age, approached shyly, holding his mother's hand. "Hi, Marcus," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think you're really brave." Marcus smiled, his confidence shining through. "Thanks," he said. "But you know what? You're brave too, just for saying that." The boy beamed, and his mother wiped away a tear. Meanwhile, the fallout from Frank Miller's actions continued to ripple through the law enforcement community. His trial and subsequent sentencing had become a case study in the consequences of unchecked power. Police departments across the country were implementing reforms to avoid similar scandals. Internal review processes were overhauled, and training programs emphasized empathy, accountability, and community engagement. For Miller himself, life in prison was a stark contrast to the authority he once wielded. Stripped of his badge and reputation, he faced the daily reality of being judged by those around him. In a rare letter to the court, Miller expressed regret, not for his actions but for the consequences they had brought upon him. "I've lost everything," he wrote. "I've paid the price. What more do they want from me?" The public response was unequivocal. Accountability wasn't a punishment. It was a necessity. As Nathan and Marcus reflected on the past year, they found themselves filled with gratitude, not just for the progress they had made, but for the people who had stood by them. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, Marcus turned to his father. "Do you think people will forget about this someday?" he asked. Nathan shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "I don't think they'll forget," he said. "Because this isn't just our story anymore. It's everyone's story. And as long as people keep telling it, the message will live on." Marcus nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Then I'll keep telling it," he said firmly. Nathan smiled, his pride in his son evident. "I know you will," he said, "and I'll be right there with you." The impact of Marcus and Nathan's journey extended far beyond their city. Their fight for justice became a blueprint for others, inspiring communities across the nation to stand up against injustice and demand change. For Marcus, the experience had shaped him into a young leader, determined to use his voice to help others. And for Nathan, it had reaffirmed his belief in the power of courage and unity. Together, they had turned their pain into progress, their struggle into strength, and their story into a movement that would continue to grow. As the sun set over the city, the Carters sat together, reflecting on all they had accomplished and all that still lay ahead. They didn't have all the answers, but they knew one thing for certain: they were stronger together. Because in the face of injustice, their love and determination had become an unstoppable force for change. The story of Marcus and Nathan Carter is a powerful reminder of how resilience and courage can transform even the darkest moments into catalysts for change. What began as an act of cruelty against a vulnerable boy unfolded into a nationwide reckoning, forcing society to confront systemic injustices and demand accountability. At its core, this is a story of love, a father's unwavering determination to protect his son and ensure he is treated with dignity. Nathan's actions demonstrated the profound strength that comes from standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem insurmountable. For Marcus, the experience was transformative. From a moment of helplessness, he found his voice, proving that even the smallest acts of bravery can inspire monumental change. The Carters' journey underscores the importance of community. It was the voices of bystanders, the power of social media, and the collective outrage of people across the nation that turned this personal fight into a movement. It's a testament to what we can achieve when we come together to challenge injustice and demand a better future for all. The story also serves as a warning. Power without accountability is dangerous. Frank Miller's actions revealed the flaws in systems designed to protect and serve, showing us the urgent need for reform. But more than that, it shows us the necessity of vigilance, of never accepting the status quo when it fails to uphold basic human rights. Above all, Marcus and Nathan's journey leaves us with a simple but profound lesson. Change begins with each of us. Whether it's speaking out against injustice, supporting those in need, or advocating for systemic reform, we all have the power to make a difference. If this story moved you, we want to hear your thoughts. Was it inspiring? If you thought the story was good, comment with a 1. If you thought it was amazing, comment with a 2. And don't stop there. Share your own stories. Have you ever faced moments of injustice? How did you overcome them? Let's keep the conversation going, because stories like Marcus and Nathan's remind us of the power we have when we come together. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss more meaningful stories like this one. And most importantly, share your thoughts about this story in the comments below. Your voice matters, and we can't wait to hear from you.